Now, is there really a God that can be explained scientifically? This is the question we have to ask ourselves to try to explain and try to understand, get our hands around this 2012 question. Do we have some sort of divine creator that is not just the purview of religion, but we can act? It goes all the way back to 815 AD. The Archbishop of Lyon in France wrote an edict called Against the Foolish Opinion of the Masses About Hail and Thunder, in which he openly says that the pagan people believed they were seeing cloud ships from Magonia that were flattening crops into circles. And he issued a prohibition against people taking the crops out of the circles, because apparently the farmers were complaining, because when these crop circles would come down, all the pagans would haul them off for fertility rituals. So when you consider why they might have been doing this, it would imply that there might be some sort of energy associated with the crops that would raise consciousness, and you're going to see throughout this presentation a lot more of that. So fairy rings in the 12th century, a ring of daisies caused by elves dancing. Well, that's one form, but of course another form that it's often seen in is this kind of lithograph that you see from the 1800s, in which the legend has it that these circles show up in the grass, and there's a bunch of fairies running around in circles and making it get flattened down. The mowing devil story, this was kind of like the mainstream media of the day. Starts out in 1678 that you have a farmer who has somebody to come by and chop the crops down. And when the mower asked too much money for what he was doing, the farmer swore, "I'd rather have the devil mow down these crops than you." The whole field lit up as if it was on fire, and there was a perfect circle in the crops the next morning, so neat that no mortal man could have done it. And so they believed, of course, that the devil was responsible, which we now know is entirely not true. Dr. Robert Plot, 1696, was diagramming crop circles. You can see some here, some examples of this. Again, showing you crop formation showing up way before the time of recorded history that we would normally think of. Then in 1972, there was a sighting where the air was completely still, but these two guys heard a noise. Something was pushing down the wheat, a great imprint taking shape, and the wheat was forced down in a clockwise direction. A circle inscribed like the opening of a lady's fan. So this is obviously an eyewitness testimony showing us that there is an advanced technology responsible for crop circles going back far into antiquity, which cannot be explained by conventional means at all. So you had originally just single circles in the 70s. This is when the modern crop circle phenomenon really got started. Then it broke into groups of 4 like this. This pattern showed up a lot, which we now know is representative of the goddess, the pregnant stomach, as you can see here. This is a much more recent formation showing the goddess in a more stark form than we were used to seeing. Here you have 3 goddess images, if you notice, the head and stomach here and here and here. And this made it onto the cover of a Led Zeppelin CD box set from 1991. The end of 91, the winter, 91, because I got it for Christmas. No, not 1990, I'm sorry. This formation seems to illustrate 3-dimensional geometry. As you can see here, we have reason to believe that each one of these is a goddess symbol. Like this is a goddess here, and so's that, and so's that. So they're all kind of sharing the same pregnant belly in this case. But then what you have is the first dimension, the point in the sphere. The second dimension being when the point starts rotating and goes into rotational movement. The third dimension, if you connect the dots between these straight lines, then you have a spiral that's going up the face of the Great Pyramid, or something similar to it. Can everybody see that? Anybody not see that? Okay. I'm sorry, guys, that we lost a half an hour, because they are not going to let us stay in this room late. So I'm going to have to just rush for a while, and you're going to have to excuse me that it's just going to be a bit frenetic. But I'll slow down a little bit as we go on. The Mandelbrot set, there were people who meditated and said they'd like to see that formation, and then it showed up in the crops the next day, showing that the circle makers are responding to our consciousness in a very accurate way. This formation showed up in 15 minutes from when there was a truck driver going by. He didn't see anything. 15 minutes later, the farmer found that formation in his field, clearly showing that it was not being done by a human agency that we would normally think of. Here's another beautiful example of a crop circle with 3 windmill shapes, and you can see the embedded geometry when you connect the dots in there. This is a Koch snowflake, a fractal, and people debated over whether that's what it really was, and the crop circle makers came back with another formation and put a snowflake in it, just to make the point. Yeah, it is a snowflake. This is obviously a bunch of hedgehogs running round and round caused this, as we said yesterday. No, nothing paranormal going on there. Really amazing. And this one is even more amazing. The amount of technology that's responsible to do something like this, because you got to remember, when you look at something like this, these are stalks of wheat that have been pushed down on dirt. It's not the kind of canvas that you usually expect could have such an accurate picture drawn into it. It's very strange. This whole formation and the whole phenomenon is very strange, and now we know historically that it goes way back in time. Now, there are some crop circle researchers who try to say that there's lines in the Bible about crop circles. I've looked into that, and I haven't found anything conclusive. I think it's kind of an intuitive stretch, so I'm not using that data. Now, are there any circles that basically are talking about this 2012 shift in such a way as to imply that there is some sort of galactic-driven evolution that's coming to us? So here you have the chromosome formation showing broken chromosomes, which again is a concept that's associated with cell mitosis. We have a DNA formation clearly showing you a double helix. The same kind of thing here with extra helixes in a tetrahedral shape, and then boom, this is 1999, you get what appears to be triple-strand DNA. Now, I'm not one of these 12-strand DNA kind of people. I think that's way off base. You can't have 12 strands. The whole thing runs on the fact that these two strands wrap up like a ball of twine into a big sphere. And I have an interview with Dr. Glenn Ryan talking about that. But it is interesting that this at least symbolically indicates the DNA will go through some sort of major change. Here's another gorgeous formation showing DNA with the ladders, and you can see the double helix spinning around itself here. Now, this again is what I consider to be possibly a sign of the galaxy programming our DNA. If you consider this to be like the Milky Way with the arms, and then you see these yods. These are called yods here, like in the Tower card in the Tarot. You see it symbolizes spiritual forces coming into manifestation. In this case, this is the fall of kings. It's an archetype we all go through in our lives in which materialism is smashed and the crown is thrown off. This is the crown of ego. And the lightning and these guys symbolize spiritual force coming into manifestation. So this just came out this year. So this also indicates, of course, very, very substantial social changes, as well as the possibility when you get the double helix involved, that this is like a DNA-forming energy. So it's very fascinating. Now, we did get this past season the definitive 2012 formation, and here it is. This is an alignment of the planets as it is at the end of 2012. Now, of course, if you saw me on the panel with Sean David Morton yesterday, you'll know that people can quibble over the fact that the positions of the planets are not necessarily 100% accurate, but they're pretty darn close. Okay, you can see that. That's a really nice alignment there between the formation and what's really there, the Earth and Mars. And they're so close that you can't really say that this was anything other than what was being intended. Because with the faster planets rather, like Mercury, I mean, that's going to move so fast that you're only in like a 10-day window no matter what at the most. So you got Saturn and Jupiter there, and then you got Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Of course, Pluto is the one that's got everybody scratching their head because it's out of position. In my mind, it's just that the designer couldn't have gotten a good circle to be drawn right over here in the middle of all this. It wouldn't have looked right. So they wanted to make sure we got it right. That's my opinion. Circle makers came back and widened the shape of the sun. You notice now, if we go back to the previous slide, that Earth is this guy right here. So this is Venus, okay? So if you go back again, there's the Earth, and the sun's orbit has now completely stretched out to the orbit of Venus. So that shows a very substantial change in the solar system. That's some sort of prophecy, which means we got to stop looking into Planet X and we got to look into what's happening in the solar system. Also, the farmer tried to drive over the crops with his tractor, creating these straight lines. This actually ended up inadvertently fitting in with Gerald Hawkins' crop circle theorems, which is fascinating. Again, what seems to be a deliberate act of sabotage becomes just part of the plan, and that's how synchronicity always works. You know, the negative forces seem like they're throwing things at you, and yet you just bounce back, and it becomes a beautiful thing. Now, we're going to talk about the climate change later, in which all these planetary changes are going to be seen in the solar system. But because this is our longer talk, or at least it was until we lost a half an hour, what about the geometry? Let's look again at this crop circle in which you're seeing what is called a tetrahedron. This is like a pyramid. If you look at this as the base, and these are the faces of the pyramid, this is the tip, you got a really nice geometry in there, three-dimensional. Now here is a diagram of it when you have one on the top and one on the bottom. This is the way it shows up in systems of energy and, as I'm going to show you now, in systems of consciousness. And this is going to look really puzzling at first, but it's all going to make sense as we go on. It turns out that when you look at planets and the rotational energy of some sort of hyperdimensional fluid, let's call it, that when it flows through planets and creates geometry, you get these particular node points at 19.5 degrees where the tetrahedron will show its energy signature. So let's look at Jupiter. Now, this great red spot has been there for 300 years, hanging out at the same latitude. No scientist can explain why it's never moved, but yet it's perfectly in alignment with the geometry if you see that this is like a force inside the planet. It does not mean that you're actually talking about a physical object in the planet. What it means is you're talking about an energy current running through the planet. And now we're seeing even, there's also the great dark spot of Neptune has the same thing. Mars has a giant shield volcano at this same latitude called Olympus Mons, except it's on the northern version of it. This shows up on the sun with the sunspots in terms of how far they go into the northern latitude. So there's multiple examples of this. And now we know when we look at the background dust of the entire cosmos that it's organized into a geometric shape like this. Again, suggesting that these geometries have some sort of meaning for us that is very mysterious. Now I'm going to take you off in a totally different direction for those of you who were here yesterday and talk about Bradley Cowan. I found out about his work in 2000. People got very, very excited when they saw my material on the web because they were using his methods to trade stocks on the stock market. Well, his methods are based on W.D. Gann, who was using a form of geometry to trade stocks. And he's a Freemason, so he's bringing this out of like ancient traditions and having it come into the modern time. So what was Gann all about? Well, basically, my explanation of what this all means is that humanity, our emotional body, oscillates between being hot and uncomfortable, in which case we sell stock because we're panicking. When we get hot, it's like, imagine now if the room suddenly got really, really hot, and you're all locked in here and we can't get out. People are going to start freaking out after a while. There's going to be yelling, there's going to be panic, there's going to be pandemonium because nobody can get out and they wonder what the heck's going on. They don't know if they're safe or not. So if you were in the markets, you're going to start selling all your stock. But then if it suddenly cools down, and we're like, oh, thank God. Then finally people are going to be like, yeah, let's buy. Let's put money back into the market, right? So what you actually are looking at when you see these stock market geometries is when you look at a stock market graph, you are looking at an index of human behavior in terms of how everyone thinks and feels. And so if you know what you're doing, you can make money with this. So here's how it works. There are very precise geometric factors in how hot or cool everyone is on the planet. That was Gann's big discovery. You can see geometry in stocks by balancing the price, which is the vertical, with the time, which is the horizontal, right? So you're counting along in time, and then the price is up here. So you have those two sides of the graph. You look at the low and the high. Like if your graph is going up and you have a bottom point and then you have a top point, you measure those points, and then you draw a straight line between them, okay? You calculate the distance in time, which is the distance going along down here, and you figure out how much that is, and you got to calculate the exact amount of time units, not just trading hours, but the exact amount of time. Then you calculate the distance in price. How much of a price variance have you got? You now have the bottom and side of a triangle, okay? Can everybody remember the Pythagorean theorem? So what does that mean? If you know this length and you know this length, then you square them, and then you take the square root of that, and you get the hypotenuse, and then you get a length for the hypotenuse. Well, that's what you get. You get a price-time vector. That's what it's called. Now, this is all set up, and you're going to see how this works in just a second. Amazingly, these price-time vectors between the lows and highs of stock market movement will almost always be the same length. That should not happen. It doesn't seem like it happens because some of these triangles are really short, right? Like they might be really tall, but then really short in time. That would be a very big whipsawing movement in the market, whether it goes straight up or straight down. But what's even more amazing is not only are these, but like I said, again, with the Pythagorean theorem, right, the hypotenuse is going to be the same in terms of its actual length in space once you calculate all these things out. When you flatten out the graphs and get them perfect, which is balancing the price and the time axis, they end up having all 60-degree angles to each other. So this is geometry. Now I'm going to show you how this works. The idea here is, you can imagine now like a tetrahedron in space, and it seems to be rotating somehow, and as it rotates, it's actually pulling human consciousness up and down between this hot, where we're freaking out and we sell, and this cool, where we're relaxing and we buy. Now, check this out. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 91 to 92, right out of Cowan's book. I do have his permission to do this. And these are your price-time vectors, which you get by calculating the time and the price. So you see that the values are about the same, 230, 235, 243, so that one's a little wide. 237, 236, 219, 244, 233, 239. So you notice how this keeps happening, and you notice how triangular all these are here? Can anybody not see what I'm talking about? So what you're looking at here is actually faces of a tetrahedron that are rotating, and as it rotates, human consciousness is dancing up and down. So you want to look at the whole stock market, this piece of paper that's printed on, as if it's like a balloon that's been unwrapped off of a three-dimensional object. And when you wrap this paper around the object, you're going to get it to fit more precisely. So these are the same point on the tetrahedron. These are two faces, and because you're seeing it flattened out, these are not connected, and these two are not connected. But in fact, this is just one tetrahedron rotating on two faces. So that's how it works, and you can almost see the 60-degree angle there. But again, if you balance out price and time, then you're going to see this, this relationship much more blatantly. That's called a balanced chart, and Gann was very good at doing that. He also found that ellipses would contain the price-time movement. It never goes outside the ellipses. So the only trick to know there is that the length of the whole entire price-time vector, the ellipse will never be bigger than half of that. And that will never, you can see here how the stocks never fall outside the ellipse. They always stay inside that boundary. That's hyperdimensional geometry. And you're going to see how this works in terms of the physics in just a second. So here's a longer-term cycle from 90 to 92 showing multiple faces of the tetrahedron as they're flipping around in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Now, people are using this system to trade. In fact, he also claims that he found a cube. There's some controversy over whether this is true, but these are the faces of what he purported to be a cube, showing potentially the same kind of movements. And he can do a composite graph and actually get a remarkably accurate prediction of what the stocks are going to do. This is his composite prediction, and this is the actual movement of the market. So you can see how beneficial this would be if you could use this. He now has a computer program that's allowing you to do that. It also appears that he is actually W.D. Gann reincarnated. As you can see, there's a lot of facial similarity there. So this is some fascinating stuff. Another thing that I didn't really show you, I thought it was in here, is that a lot of this stuff is based on planetary cycles. In other words, the movements of the planets can be very precisely broken down, and they also have a strong effect on how we are thinking. So how could this geometry be causing vortexes, clouds on planets, and also be affecting our consciousness at the same time in such a dramatic way that you can see from 1990 to 92 this very blatant example of tetrahedral stock market movement? Well, all of the answer comes back to the fact that we live in a sea of consciousness energy. And this is a science called cymatics, the fluid vibration. If you just take ordinary fluid and you vibrate it with little sand particles in it, then lo and behold, here's what you get. There's your tetrahedron. Okay? Does everybody see that? And there's your ellipse. You see the same elliptical thing? You notice how it's half, that you got that length and then you got half the diameter there? Well, that's how this stuff is working. What you're actually seeing is that our minds and physical matter are being affected by this hyperspatial energy. It's not in physical form, but the energy vibrates, and in so doing creates geometry, which in turn affects our consciousness. What's so fascinating about cymatics is you can see here that as you vibrate the same particles of sand, that's all this is little tiny fine particles in water, that as time goes on and you crank up the tone, you get more and more complex geometry. And you can go back at any time and play the old tone again, and you're going to get exactly the same shape showing up. So these are stable. They stay there. So if physical matter, when you get larger amounts of this water with particles in it together and you vibrate them with sound, you start to get what looks like molecules binding together to form larger lattices. So if matter is made like this, and all the matter in the room, let's say, is a certain frequency, then what happens when the frequency goes up? Would we still even be here in a conventional sense? Or does some sort of transmutation happen? Well, this is the next mystery that we actually have scientific data for and that ties in with a lot of these black ops programs. We can look at the work of David Hudson, who studied what he called ORMUS elements, or natural microclusters, and we'll explain what that means. He calls them that because it stands for orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. Microcluster iridium, these are little clusters of radiation, the radioactive compound iridium. He heats them up to 850 degrees Celsius, and with no other special treatment except that they're microclustered, that they have this special geometry to their structure, they would disappear from optical view, and on a scale they wouldn't have any weight. Then if you cool the space back down, the iridium would reappear on the scale and regain its mass. So what this means is 850 degrees Celsius. Why would that matter? Just think about it for a second. What is temperature? And what's heat? It's vibration of molecules, right? So all we're saying is with natural microclusters, and I'm going to show you what they look like in a minute, they're just geometry. It's when atoms and molecules get together and form these same geometric shapes, which they naturally will do. It's a science that we don't know about because it's been hidden from us for the most part. So that geometry already has a harmonic frequency, and when you start heating it up, it vibrates to the point that those little molecules reach light speed because the harmonics are mutually reinforcing and the speed keeps getting faster and faster. So you get up to that critical mass, in this case 850 Celsius, and they pop over into this higher frequency where they're no longer visible to us in our plane of existence. So here it is right here. You can see 850 degrees Celsius. And the mass, the weight, this is the normal weight. It just completely drops. But notice how much is fluctuating in the other direction. Notice how much heavier the mass was getting as he started heating it up. So these are very, very strange particles. This is part of why our scientists, the scientists who find out about this are either told to shut up and paid off, or they're brought into the covert world, because there's all sorts of wonderful and weird things you can do with these guys once you know what you're talking about. Well, there's other examples of transmutation that you can look at in nature, specifically tornadoes. Tornadoes are an area in which there is a high degree of rotation, but this is only one form of the rotation. Remember the great red spot on Jupiter? So what did that tell you? It told you that hyperdimensional energy can create a storm. When it's spinning around, you get a big vortex there. Well, this is a big vortex of spinning energy. So could there be a hyperdimensional component to the energy? You bet. So we're going to look at some interesting things. Now, this is conventional. This is nothing unusual. This is what would happen when you got these the wooden boards on a fence that are just clattering in the wind, and then a piece of wood blows through them. It's in a crack, so there's nothing unusual there. But what is unusual is things like this. I don't know if you can see this. a little bit too bright. But what you have here is a plank that has shot through the middle of a tree, right through the middle. And here's another example where you have a floorboard that has gone right through the middle of a tree. Now, some skeptics might try to attack this, but we have some other examples that are really good, such as straw that's being blown right into a tree. Now, you can't tell me that a straw could have the density to penetrate through the bark of a tree like that, no matter how fast you hit the tree with it. This is because the tornado is softening up the matter around itself, allowing it to interpenetrate very easily, because in that hyperdimensional energy the tornado is making, the molecules are up-leveling in frequency, and then they can start blending like this. Here's multiple cases from an old picture here, and you can see where it comes from. That's a mainstream media source showing pieces of straw getting blown through wood. So this is a common thing that happens in tornadoes. There's also apocryphal reports of, of roosters getting blown inside jugs, which is very strange. But, again, you can have all sorts of strange things happen. I don't have slides of it here, but we also know there's been reports of metal gates and chunks of metal that just get fused together. My ex-girlfriend lived in Oklahoma, and she heard reports after tornadoes of the cows getting stuck in the wall of the barn. And like the rear end of the cow is on the outside of the barn, and the rest of the cow is on the inside. And these people are fundamentalist Christian for the most part, and so they just get really freaked out and think it's the devil or something. They don't want to talk to anybody about it. But it would be nice if they'd take a picture, because then we'd be able to do something with that. But of course, this also invokes the famous Philadelphia experiment, in which, as I've said on the radio before, what really seems to have caused that is simply this high-intensity arc welding experiment, where they were building battleships and sending bolts of energy through the hull of the ship to weld the ship together, and then they would have these big black holes appear, these black holes in the room about maybe that big, and then like tools would disappear and all the power would shut off. And they ended up filming it, and that led them to build it as a way to try to cloak the ship from radar, having no idea that the whole ship would disappear. So that's a black ops way of looking at it, but we also have these out in the open ways that are scientific, such as the Hutchison effect, in which you get direct evidence of matter blending. In this case, he's got a piece of aluminum, which he had to saw it open in order to see this afterwards. But he was able to push a knife inside the block of aluminum. Just like, literally just melt it right in, and it never gets hot, by the way. This is a cold temperature. Then what he had to do is just saw the whole thing open in order to show that the knife had been pushed directly inside the aluminum. And this is where he did it with a piece of wood, and then he had to saw the whole thing open. You can see that, how they just blended right together. Here's a cold melted aluminum bar in which he takes a penny and pushes it in. I know the contrast's a little bit too high on the thing, but you can still see it there, and there's a better shot of it. So again, this is very unusual stuff here. And all Hutchison is doing is creating very high-intensity electromagnetic fields which ultimately create the resonance necessary to change the matter phase of the aluminum. He can't predict how it's going to happen. He just tinkers around with a lot of fancy equipment, and by making these really high-intensity fields, he starts to get these strange things, including levitation and these obvious strange effects. So again, if your body went through a vortex like this, what would we say happened to you? Well, clearly, this could be the idea of some sort of transmutation of the soul. So we're dealing with a whole new way to look at things, and there's science out there that will help put the pieces together, but you have to go beyond the conventional view of our reality to do that. So, where is all this energy coming from? Where are these extra dimensions? And what is responsible for that energy coming into our reality? Well, the extra dimensions are all in time. And so, pictures like this, we've all seen the Dali before, so Salvador Dali's picture, but what he's really talking about is like, this was based on Einstein, and for the time it was this really amazing new theory. Now we know more than we did then, that time is actually, in fact, a three-dimensional domain. But we only have access to one domain, and we're stuck in a particular current of that domain. So, time's three-dimensional, but only one dimension of that time reflects into our reality, and we're stuck in it like a stream. We can't get out, normally. But is there a way in which what's happening to that matter when you either create anti-gravity or when you flip it over so that it disappears? It's actually going over into a plane in which time is three-dimensional and space is only one-dimensional. But the part that's so weird is that over there, things still look like they do here. It's just that now you're in what we would call the dream plane or the afterlife plane or the astral plane. It's the plane where ghosts are. This explains why ghosts sometimes are visible and sometimes are not, and people that have seen them. So we have a lot of interesting stuff that proves that this is what's going on, because all the basic quantum mechanics problems can be solved when you do that. And this is the work of Dewey Larson, who's flagged in the law of one material, as many of you know. Here's the site reciprocal system. So here's the idea, and if you've seen 2012 Enigma, I'm going to review a little bit of it with you now, and maybe you'll learn something more from it this time when I go through it again. Think about Einstein's fabric of space-time, where he says that gravity is just the result of the planet pushing down the fabric and that things roll towards the planet, which is not really true, but it's kind of a good approximation. Imagine that everything on the fabric and above is the world of space-time, and imagine that if you can punch through this fabric, what's on the bottom? That would be a parallel reality. That's time-space. Well, obviously, we can punch a hole through, and that's the wormhole. So by moving through time-space, you can pinch space together and move through time. This allows you not only to travel in space, but to travel in time as well. And of course, our reality is like the outside of a torus. That's all space-time, and time-space is on the inside. That's actually real physics. In fact, we know from Black Ops whistleblowers who've told me this privately, that as space-time curls in more and more on itself into a torus shape, that once it reaches that toroidal point, that's when it flips over and becomes time-space. So it curls in on itself by curling through a wormhole, and that's what happens as you reach light speed. When you exceed light speed velocity, it curls over and everything inverts. So again, 3 dimensions of space, 1 of time. Normally you're moving around 3 of space, but you're stuck in time like a river. The 3 dimensions of time to us are over there in time-space, and 1 dimension of space to us. You can move around when you're over there in time. This means, by the way, most of the time when you create anti-gravity, it becomes invisible, because gravity is actually the engine that is powering time for us. This is another one of these weird alternative physics things that the Black Ops people know that has been hidden from us, is that time is powered by gravity, okay? So if you turn off your gravity, you totally change your reference frame to time. And if you get anti-gravity, then you can now move around in time-space. You become invisible at a certain point. You flip over, like I was talking about. And by moving around in that anti-gravity, when you come back down, you might be in a totally different time. Because distance traveled over there equals time travel over here. That's the funny part about how this works. So the entry and exit points are very important. Now, last year, if you saw my 2012 Enigma video, you remember me talking about fairy rings? Well, those were crop circles, but back in the old days, it wasn't just something cool that showed up in the crops. There's all sorts of legends about people walking inside these fairy rings. Because once you go in there, you go into another reality. That's what the legend would say, that you would meet these gnomes, fairies, and dwarves and elves. So this is not just somebody's imagination. This is what they actually saw when they went inside. For whatever reason, it doesn't work anymore, or at least it doesn't seem to work for most people. But back in the old days, these were portals between space-time and time-space. And so the old legend actually says, and this is so fascinating, my contact Daniel, who you've heard about on the video, this guy that worked on an alleged government time travel project, told me that, in fact, the legend would say that if you go into the fairy ring from this side, you have to leave in the same exact direction. Because if you go in this way and then you end up going over here on the way out, you could actually come through into a whole different time in history. And this was well known back in the old days, and so you have to go out the way you came in. That's very important. That's exactly what we would expect if you transitioned into time-space. So here's another funny example. You've all seen this too. This is Escher, MC Escher. And I'd like you to just think about for a minute the idea that you're walking through what appears to be a physical reality over there, but the whole entire reality around you is different than you thought. So these kinds of diagrams of Dali and Escher, I don't think are just fantastic things to look at. I think they do represent people who are starting to telepathically download what's really going on and how it works. It's an excellent way to visualize. You can just imagine that all these other realities are humming around us at the same time, and they all exist, and they're all real, and they're in different frames of time. This is the science that we're now having to face, the fact that time is not linear. It's just being presented to us that way. But probabilities of the past and probabilities of the future already exist. They're already there. And we get to decide which ones we're going to have, which means we can change the past and change the future. We do have scientific proof of this at the quantum level that can show us, again, how this is working. The two-slit experiment, you shoot little particles through these slits, and they form interference patterns over here, which that's not what you'd expect. You'd expect to only get 2 lines. Instead, you're getting like 3 or 5, which is more like the behavior of waves rather than particles. So again, it's the wave-particle duality in which scientists say that if you measure it as a particle, it looks like a particle, and if you measure it as a wave, it looks like a wave. What that means is it is a particle all the time. But when you see it as a wave, it's in the time domain. So if I have a jar of mayonnaise in my hand here, and I spread it out into time so that some of it is in the past, some of it is in the present, some of it is in the future, you're not going to see a jar of mayonnaise. You're going to see this smearing-looking thing because, of course, Earth is moving through the solar system, so there's going to be a trail of movement. You're not going to see it all in one spot because if it's outside of time, it's going to be over here and it's going to be over there. So you're just going to see this sort of this faded-out wave. That's what's going on at the quantum level. That's the only proof that explains what we're seeing. Well, they've actually done this with physical objects. This is a carbon-60 molecule called a fullerene, and Zellinger shot these little guys through a diffraction grating like you just saw. They got the interference pattern, which is very crazy because what that means is solid objects, single particles, shot against this grating would break down into multiple waves. But if you don't put the diffraction grating in the way, the particles turn back into particles again. In other words, they're waves for a short time, but then they reconstitute back into a particle. So this is what we got. Just by hitting that wall, hitting the little diffraction grating in the middle, it gives just enough of a push to the buckyball here that it temporarily rolls inside out and goes into time, temporarily turns into a wave, just long enough to reconstitute itself and go back into space-time where it will turn into a particle again. But if you catch it right at the point that it turns into a wave, you can get an interference pattern off of one buckyball. Well, that's a chunk of matter. That's a physical object. What about the size of the object? Oh, that comes later. The size of the object here is comparable to DNA, 2 nanometers, which is extremely significant for us because that means that the DNA molecule is of a size that is small enough to be subject to the effect of the time field, to flip in and out of time. And whatever that time field is, which we've already shown you now, can be shown in the stock market graph with the geometry affecting how people buy and sell, that is showing up in the way that the planets have their energy flowing through them. And you're going to see a lot more about biology and consciousness. Now, it's so interesting because if you look at these basic geometries that are created by vibration, they invert. In other words, you can flip them inside out and get the other geometry. If you take the cube in space and you flip it into time, it becomes an octahedron. So these two are interpenetrated. Now that can be demonstrated mathematically, and that's also what's happening. This is the only way that matter can work. A physical object that might be in a cubic pattern in our reality in time-space is going to be in this octahedral pattern. The tetrahedron, look at that. This one is in space-time, the other one is in time-space. It actually maintains its shape. That's the only one that does that. And then you got the dodecahedron here. You flip that over into time and it becomes an icosahedron rather. So this is a very advanced, very secret science that the covert guys do not want you to know. Here's your microclusters I was talking about before, like the iridium that you could heat up to 850 degrees Celsius and it would disappear from view. This is an icosahedron. It's got 561 atoms in it. And they all naturally want to bond together. Now the funny thing about this is that the electrons have been measured, and I put electrons in quotation marks because all it is a flow of energy. But the electrons have been measured to not stay inside the atom like you'd think and be orbiting the nucleus. All of the electrons for all of these atoms in 561 altogether break out of their individual atoms and orbit the center of the cluster all the way around. So that it's like there's one giant atom here. Okay, that's very, very strange. It's in a mainstream science textbook called Microcluster Physics by Sugano and Koizumi. And I've talked about this before. Here's a cube octahedron, the same thing. This is an actual diagram from Sugano and Koizumi's textbook showing you a real cluster. And this is made out of gold, and you notice that the geometry is changing. So what this means is that down there at the quantum level in the ether, it's all geometric energy because it's all vibrating. And the vibration creates geometry. That's Hans Jenny. That's what I was showing you with cymatics, right? So as the vibration creates geometry, there's currents. It doesn't always stay the same, and the geometry changes because this is fluctuations in the force, disturbances in the force, if you will. You can measure them down there when you're looking at microclusters. So again, all this relates back to DNA and how DNA is an antenna for this force because it's at that level where these quantum things can happen. Now, I talked about in the video Kuznetsov and the fact that he was showing how you could take disease and transmit it into healthy cells just by energy alone. These are obviously hermetically sealed, showing that the patterns of sickness or health can be transmitted through space as a wave. That DNA is actually responsive to some sort of quantum wave. Well, look at this. If you haven't already seen this, all of these various viruses are little harmonic clusters. Well, what does that also mean? This gets back to the Rife machine. This gets back to toning and back to keeping a positive attitude in your mind. A virus in your body is only as powerful as the frequency that allows it to continue to exist. You can out-resonate viruses with your positive attitude because the positive attitude, the joy, is the fundamental nature of this conscious energy that we're talking about. So again, a little bit of review from the 2012 Enigma video. Maybe some of you haven't seen it. I read this book when I was 7 years old, and I was fascinated to read about the experiments done between the author of the book, Sherman, and his partner, Watkins, who was an Antarctic explorer. They were doing telepathy experiments. After Watkins died, and you can watch the video to learn more about this, 2012 Enigma, just Google it if you haven't already seen it. Watkins contacted Sherman telepathically and described what he had to do from his perspective, which is time-space, to get inside Sherman's mind. And he said there was that Sherman's soul from over there looked like a series of spheres that were all stuck inside of each other, like a nest, like an onion. And he had to find a channel to get to the center. What he said was that each sphere was like a part of Sherman's mind, and that it usually had all this violent movement around the surface. And that as Sherman would meditate and calm his mind down, the movement would slow down. And that he had to get like 7 of these spheres in a row to kind of all settle down and get into a groove so that he could find a way to dance through it and get into the center. And it was only when he got to the center of the nest that he could get a telepathic message through from over there to Sherman's mind. It took me years to figure out that all those spheres represent the chakras of the body. And when you're doing a Kundalini meditation, you're bringing all those chakras up so that they're not splayed out in your body, but they're all in that single point in your head where they become that nest of spheres. This is why meditation is so important, because you're slowing the spheres down, and in so doing, you get them all together so that you can get a channel to go through without all the movement messing it up. So this is what that looks like. And right here in the center of your brain, the geometric center of your brain, is what we call the pineal gland, which is the hypergate. It's the junction point between space-time and time-space. It's all based on water that's hanging out inside this little pine cone-shaped gland. Now, many ancient cultures have talked about the pineal gland with great reverence. Here is a cylinder seal from Sumer in which he's holding a little staff. And what it turns out you have to do to decipher this is hold this guy up to a mirror and look at the mirror images that are reflected on one side and the other side of this. So that's the original. And then when you put the mirror images together, you start seeing other characters showing up, including this reptilian-looking guy, which is more like your Anunnaki type, and what looks to be diagrams of the pineal gland. Now, according to Dan Burish, he only released this one graphic, but according to him, the Majestic 12 was able to completely decipher the plans of how to build one of these devices that we're going to talk about in just a minute that looks through time using these blueprints from cylinder seals just like this, which doesn't seem very plausible, but that's what he claims that they were able to do. So the pine cone symbol, again, if this is this very, very important gland in your brain and ancient people knew much more about than we give them credit for, then we might expect to see it throughout all these different cultures. The Egyptian god Osiris's staff has it on the top. King Tut has an example of the Kundalini serpent coming out through the forehead. The Babylonian god Tammuz holds the pine cone in his hand there. Notice that. The Hindu god Shiva, his head is in the shape of a pine cone, just like you would expect if this is through all these different cultures. The bindi, or the third eye, again, is a representation of the pineal gland. Why would they bother to do that? Out of all the things they could do to their body, any type of makeup you could do, why put a third eye on your head? Unless there's something really important going on here. Okay? The god Bacchus, god of drunkenness and revelry, has a staff with a pine cone on top. Dionysus, which is akin to Bacchus, same thing, pine cone on top. There's another statue of Dionysus with a pine cone. Even Buddha, look at the hair of Buddha. There again, you see the pine cone. There's even a Bible quote from Jesus talking about the pineal gland. And I'm not going to spend as much time on this as I did in 2012 Enigma for those of you who saw the video, but he said, if your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light, implying that the pineal gland is your gateway. This is Jesus the Master now. This is Christianity telling you this. Focus in on your pineal gland, and you're going to be able to access higher consciousness. Surely we say the Vatican doesn't follow this, or do they? And for those of you who haven't seen this, this is going to blow your mind. Here in the middle of the Vatican Square is a gigantic statue. Look at the size of the person. A gigantic statue, actually that's somebody on the lawn, but the person would only be about this tall, of a pine cone, flanked on either side by these Egyptian-looking birds in an open sarcophagus, which is right out of Egyptian mysticism of there being no more death, the transcension. So this is not just Christianity. What the heck is it doing in the Vatican if they've told us everything they know? There's your mirror-polished sphere, right? Remember, spheres within spheres, so there's another symbol being given. And here's your guy, so you can see how huge this thing is. There's like nothing else this size in terms of sculptures. Why a pine cone if it was so unimportant? And then what's up with these Egyptian-looking lions down at the bottom with Egyptian hieroglyphics on the bottom? This is the Vatican. And there it is. What are they not telling us? They're not really that interested in Christianity. They've got control of Christianity, but they know a lot more than what's in Christianity. And they take an Egyptian obelisk and figure, oh yeah, we'll just throw a cross on top. Nobody will suspect anything. Yeah, right. Well, now here's the pay dirt. Because the Pope's own staff has this trunk, which is like the world tree, and that's other symbolism we talk about in 2012 Enigma. And there's the pineal gland. There's the pine cone, symbolizing how the Pope is God's spokesperson, that he's drawing in the voice of the Creator, the voice of God, through his pineal gland. This is symbolized by the staff of how he is then speaking to you the words of God, which now nobody believes anymore. But back then, of course, that was part of the symbolism. So it also secretes DMT, which a lot of people are taking now. I don't recommend doing any drugs at all, but there are people experimenting with this. potions such as yopo and ayahuasca are giving people profound experiences, including senses of time being dilated, that they're traveling through time, going to paranormal realms, encountering spiritual beings or mystical transdimensional modalities, and that's actually an encyclopedia definition of a DMT experience. That's not like some fringe website. I did LSD and stuff back in the day. I have never done ayahuasca or any of these drugs, but they're similar. So what's the secret? Why is all this working? The secret starts on a very simple level, which is that the interior is filled with a special type of water. Water that has microclusters in it, incidentally. So that geometry can flip in and out of space and time, like we were talking about. The water will start to calcify as you get older, meaning that what you're going to see is something like this. This is how they figure out where the center of your brain is on an MRI. So if you have a tumor, this pulpy mass of your brain gets pushed over, and now it's going to show up over here. So that's how they're able to tell if you have a brain tumor. This is what happens when you go through your life without eating the right kind of food, without drinking the right kind of water, which means more organic fruits and vegetables, more of fresh, either reverse osmosis water or purified water. Don't use fluoride toothpaste. Don't use aluminum underarm deodorant because aluminum is really bad for the pineal gland. Lots of physical exercise, lots of good breathing practices, and you can do cleanses. You can make sure that your body doesn't get over-mineralized, which is happening. So you want to avoid dairy to a large degree, use lots of water, avoid things like white flour because it'll clog up your system. Avoid things like sugar, if you can, because sugar actually causes this calcification to occur. And by keeping your brain decalcified, you can have a much higher access because you need as much of that water in your pineal gland to be free and liquid as possible, not crystallized. When you're a kid, you don't have it crystallized, and kids have much more paranormal experiences than adults do usually. But then as their diet gets bad and as they take drugs, because of course drugs are also toxic, especially like pharmaceuticals, they will start to build up in your body, in your bloodstream. You're putting chemicals in your body. They are chemicals, and they're going to create residue. So you want to stay as clean as you can in order to stop this from happening. Now here's the other thing that's weird, which you've seen on the 2012 Enigma video. The inside of this gland has rods and cones like the retina on your eye. Now some people have criticized me about this and said, oh, if the interior of the pineal gland was like a retina, then everybody would know about it in science. Well, the fact is, it can't be explained as just rods and cones. I do believe there is a hyperdimensional component to this, but the idea here is that there is actually a little television show going on in this water as it's shining through, creating a portal to time-space, and that the retina tissue is picking up some of that visual signal. I believe some of it is also being picked up on an energetic way that cannot be explained by rods and cones. But it is interesting that that's the only other part of the entire body that has retina tissue in it, is this third eye inside your head. So what happens is when you're dealing with normal light conditions, there is an electromagnetic shield that is around your pineal gland, and that shield, when it's powered up, is what stops the pineal gland from gating over into a higher frequency. Is that true? Let's think. No, I got it backwards. I'm sorry. Normally, it's not powered up, and it's when the light goes away, when you go into a dim light environment, that melatonin is secreted, which tells the pineal gland to fire up, and that's when the electromagnetic shield turns on. And when you shield the water, this is what the ancient technology tells us, when you shield the water, out of all of the references of our energy here, the space-time energy, it flips over into time-space. And you start dreaming, and you start going out of body, and that's your astral experience. And you have a silver cord, which is from your pineal gland. That's why people always say that they feel that sense of a snap in their head, and that they see this silver cord from their umbilical cord that goes back to where their body is. This is all rooted into the pineal gland. So again, darkness activates this electromagnetic activity. When your pineal gland fires up, has everybody here felt like they've had pineal experiences, pineal activation? Not too many hands. Okay. I started to get this stuff a while back when I was like, well, the first one was when I was in high school. But when it happens to you, you will definitely know that something is happening, because what happens is you get this sense almost like there's a big airplane going overhead and you can't hear anything, but you feel the pressure on your eardrums as if there's something happening to you. And sometimes it just comes in spontaneously, but you will feel this sort of, you might also feel this rushing sensation, like something inside your head is just amping up and getting faster and faster and faster. Some people hear it as a sound. It's like somebody's playing a tone in your ear, woo, and you're like, ooh. But you'll feel this, it's a disorientation kind of feeling. This is that electromagnetic shield firing up. And again, some people force this to happen with drugs, and if you want to do that, go ahead. I mean, I'm not going to tell you to, but a lot of people are doing it in this community, and they're having interesting experiences. It can also make you schizophrenic, so it's very dangerous, potentially. And therefore, I could never advise to do it. And I've been off of any drugs for 17 years. Once you open the gate, either by meditation or through using these chemicals or whatever, you don't need to keep opening it. You can open it just by going and concentrating. So the water becomes that conduit to time-space, and then the inner retina and other energetic means record the visual images. So DMT appears to hyper-accelerate that activity. LSD does the same thing. It's potentially dangerous because the problem is that the electromagnetic activity can get stuck on, and that's what you have in the case of schizophrenia. Delusions, waking hallucinations, people that are hospitalized, and they found certain drugs that will slow down that electromagnetic activity called antipsychotics that keep you from having that happen. But that's all that's really going on here. So again, DMT fires up the electromagnetic shield, and this on the dollar is another symbol of the third eye. So this is showing the American secret establishment knowing the same stuff again. Here it is in Da Vinci Code, not so subtly hidden there. So could we reverse engineer the pineal gland, or has it already been done? What would we need? Well, first of all, you need a pineal gland shape, like the shape of the pine cone. In this case, we'll call it a barrel. You put water in it. Then you put the resonant microclusters in the water. Remember the geometry I was talking about? Because you want to be able to gate into time-space. You have to shield it off from all the reference signals of electromagnetic energy in our reality and be able to fine-tune how those fields are done. Then you need some kind of gas around the barrel in order to pick up the visual images that would come in from the parallel reality. Well, here's an actual diagram of Project Looking Glass. There's your barrel in the middle filled with water. Now this is huge. I mean, a person's only about this tall. And these three rings that orbit around it. When it gets fired up, and I've talked to more than one person who's used this technology, this amber glow appears around it, and then whatever it is that you want to see in space and in time will appear right here, kind of like Google Earth. And you can look at anything you want in the future. The problem is that it's only a probable reality. It's not a fixed reality. So of course, contact, as almost everybody here probably has seen the video now, the three rings, and then you get dropped into the center, and there's another shot of it. You get dropped off this gantry crane down inside. You notice the tongue-in-cheek reference to NASA here. So then Jodie Foster, of course, goes into this. There's your geometry shape again. And it fires up, and she drops down inside and goes through a marvelous wormhole type of experience. So, another movie that talks about this, Last Mimsy, you got this cube that the kids play with, and then it gives them a gate to another time. Hellraiser, the same principle, a cube in which these guys, the Cenobites, the people, when they solve the puzzle, it opens up this gateway into hell, so to speak. Well, this was actually found in Roswell. It's called the Orion Cube. It's metal, but then when you power it up, the sides fan out, and a little yellow disc forms here, and then whatever you want to see in the future appears right there. This is used as a navigation system for the guys that are powering the UFO. And it's a totally different system. Henry Deacon was just telling me this the other day. This is a totally different system than what the looking glass is. And it's much more advanced and much more accurate. So you can see the similarities here. Let's talk about Stargate technology. This is something you did not get in the 2012 Enigma video. Here's your conventional idea of how Stargates work, but actually the real ones operate on a completely different principle. This is a diagram that Dan Burish made for me. And again, some people want to discredit Dan Burish, but a lot of the things he's told me have really borne out and made sense. Look over there. What do you see right there? Can everybody see that? That's your barrel. Now, he doesn't draw it very well here, and for specific reasons, he can't go into a whole lot of detail. But this is what you should be seeing over there. This is the barrel. These are the rings. And you have to tilt it on an angle, and we'll explain what's going on here. So you tilt it on an angle, and then you have to have these two, you see the discs here? These are technologies which reflect the energy from the looking glass device back in upon itself. You also have to have these three pillars, very important, which when they're normally there, they just come up to a point. But when you turn them on, they have a very strange energy field that forms this thing that looks like gears. Those gears are not normally there. That only happens once they get powered up. Then what you do is, here's your argon containers. Of course, you got to squirt argon into the thing, keep it running. What happens is there's no ring. That's the illusion. The reality is that it just appears as this slate gray circle hanging in space. There's nothing else there but this gray circle, just like that. That's the real Stargate. If you ever are actually going to go through one of these things, that's what it looks like. That's what you end up doing. Okay? All based, again, on this technology right here. Now, the other thing he told me is interesting, is that because, remember I told you time is powered by gravity? So the gravity is a vector of time, and it's going to, when time flashes over in our dimension, the way it flashes over depends on the orientation of gravity. So when you tilt the barrel so that it's perfectly aligned with the time flow, then time can bleed over into our reality in 3 dimensions, and you get a sphere. So you get a 3-dimensional object from time. But as you tilt the barrel out of phase with the flow of time, you start shutting off the number of dimensions of time that can bleed through, and it has to be tilted to such an extreme that you get a 2-dimensional representation of time, and that's the only time, apparently, that it's safe to step through it as a Stargate. So the angle is very important here. If you tilted it differently, then you get this sphere. Does everybody understand this? I mean, it's a little bit weird, but this is how it really works. So again, they've used this time viewing device, and they've gone through these portals, and they've found out what they call the doctrine of the converging timeline paradox, which is basically talking about 2012. And I've heard this from 4 or 5 different whistleblowers at least who've talked to me about this. In 2012, everything seems to go white, and they can't see past it. It's like there's some kind of juncture that they can't get past. So this suggests a very fundamental change in the physics that's going on around that time.